the agenda that is before you, we will be navigating the legislature and the legislative process. I'll point out some key takeaways on how you could develop your own advocacy strategies and setting up meetings with your elected officials and the various types of strategies that you could take both locally and at the state level to create engagement. Let's begin with who is the legislature. There's 40 senators and there's 80 assembly members. So there's 2 houses in the state legislature. California has, and it's predominantly a Democratic legislature, 2/3 of both the Assembly and the Senate are dominated by the Democratic Party. As you could see on the Senate side, there's 31 Democrats, 9 Republicans. They seek election every 4 years. Every 4 years, they go back to their voters to seek re-election. They represent about 1 million constituents in their communities, and their term limits are now 12 years total. That has changed since 2010, that they can now fulfill their entire term in one house and not have to jump from house to house. When I worked in the legislature, I was there for 5 years and I had 3 speakers, 3 budget chairs, 3 budget sub chairs, and a slew of new legislators coming in as we were still grappling with the Great Recession. And that just made for chaos making, right? It was not consistent. There was no unified message, and onboarding new legislators made it very difficult when dealing with an ongoing budget reduction. On the Assembly side, and let me let Dina in. On the Assembly side, we have 60 Democrats, 19 Republicans, and 1 independent. They seek election every 2 years. They represent half of the constituency that the senators represent, about 500,000 constituents, and their term limits are in 2-year cycles for a total of 12 years. So on the Assembly and the Senate side, their responsibilities are to approve, to modify, to reject the governor's budget proposals. They propose legislation every year. Every year, constituents are able to come to them and let them know that there's an issue, statutorily, regulatory, that needs to be cleaned up and that can be addressed through a legislative vehicle. Their responsibilities is to make fixes, to make modifications, or to eliminate sections in the law. Any law, let me let Deshawn in. Any law pertaining to various areas in the state. It could go from education, early education, corrections, housing. So there's many issues that the legislature as a whole has to grapple and decide and determine what is the best course of action every legislative year. The state governor. The governor's role is to approve, to modify, and reject spending proposals through the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance is the governor's right hand when it comes to the budget process in that development. The governor proposes the state spending plan every January 10th, or about that time frame. Statutorily, the governor is supposed to release a budget. And this begins the dialogue on what are the state priorities? Where are we going to invest state resources that were accumulated through, and the 3 major ones are state personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax. So how is the state going to utilize these resources to meet the needs of its community? The governor then updates and revises any spending plan that was proposed in January by May. By May 14th, around that time frame, the administration, after reviewing receipts from the April tax that comes in from us paying our taxes in April, they reassess, did we get more money or did we get less money? And then updates the state budget based on those estimates and makes determinations. Do we beef up proposals that the administration had laid out, or do they rescind proposals or modify the proposals? A governor is responsible for signing or vetoing legislation as well as the state budget package. The legislature can modify what the administration has proposed, which has been the case for this administrator, for this governor. He has seen a lot of modification in his budget. The legislature is very strong, given that they have been, now that these elected officials have been able to be there for longer than 8 years, they're now seasoned. They understand how to negotiate and how to take on an issue. I'll give you one example. Assemblymember McCarty from Sacramento, he is known as the early education champion. And every year since he started, he communicated that he wanted universal TK, transitional kindergarten. Well, he made it a reality in this year's budget, where the administration said beginning in 2022-23, we will start making that a reality, where school districts will start to phase in and expand transitional kindergarten. So again, legislators can make decisions in terms of what they want in the budget and make modifications while negotiating with an administration. A governor can line item veto any part of the appropriation. So any funding amount, a governor can veto. A governor, however, cannot veto actual language, actual statutory changes that direct a department, an agency, an organization to implement a program. He can't veto that, but what he can do is he can make reductions. So the last year I was in the Assembly Budget Committee, Governor Brown vetoed our budget. It was not a balanced budget. We were running out of time in negotiations. And so the legislature punted, sent him a budget, and the governor vetoed it at that point. It was a very challenging and difficult situation when you have a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature at odds, but we had ran out of time. And so that does happen, where a governor has to step in and flex their powers and say, we're just not going to accept the budget that the legislature modifies and sends down. So there's a lot of negotiations that take place between March through June. So this chart shows you what is the steps and what is the timeframes in Sacramento that we're much more actively involved in the legislative process. From January this year, January 4th, the legislature returned to Sacramento. They began introducing legislation. When they're here in person in Sacramento, they introduce legislation. So this is a timeframe where they have spent the fall communicating with their constituents, meeting with stakeholders, talking to groups. So this is one of those hints in the fall. We're in the fall right now, folks. In the fall, your elected officials are back in their district office. So don't feel so concerned that you have to fly up to Sacramento. They have district offices. They do attend local events. Are you inviting them to local events? So come January, their staff has a list of ideas to start submitting in terms to get legislation written up. And so the deadline was February 19th to introduce legislation. By February through April, the policy committees have to have hearings to discuss each of the bills. There's a policy committee for each subject matter. So education bills go through Assembly Education Committee on the Assembly side, or the Senate Education Committee on the Senate side. Labor bills, anything related to labor, unemployment, those have their own particular hearings and their own particular committees, and they're vetted. So there's professional staff in those committees that are subject matter experts, and their responsibility is to review an idea, vet it, compare it to what has happened in the past. Is this a new idea? Is it an old idea? Have we tried it in the past? What's the history behind it? And so if you're a sponsor, if you have a great idea and you're going, I want to sponsor a bill right now, tell me how to do it. Make sure to have your background information. What is your background information? Do you know how much is this idea going to cost? Does the department that you're requesting to make the modifications have the appropriate staff? Is this a program in existence, or are you creating a new program? And so would we have to start the foundation of how you create a new grant program, a new categorical from scratch? So all of those questions, if you could get it answered, that shows up in something called a fact sheet. So every bill has something called a fact sheet, which is really neat. It gives you a synopsis of why is this relevant? Why is this legislation needed? And who are the sponsors in favor of this bill? by May 21st, that's the last day for fiscal committee, something called Assembly Appropriations Committee and Senate Appropriations Committee, to meet. If your bill costs more than $250,000 statewide, it has to be vetted through this committee. And they decide, is this a worthy cause? Can we afford it given our dynamics and our situation at the state level? And if so, it gets to move out of the appropriations committee on both sides. And most of the bills in the first house meaning assembly bills going through the assembly process, Senate bills going through the Senate process, tend to get out. Senators are not going to really reject their colleagues' bills. Assembly members aren't going to really necessarily reject their colleagues' bills on the first try. So the goal is to get out of appropriation. So if your bill does cost money, let's say you want to do a housing grant, do you have the financing mechanisms in line? Do you know which departments would administer the grant? Do you know a funding source that you're trying to tag this grant to? Is it a proposition that already passed and needs to be extended? Is it just a sunset that's taking effect and you just want an extension, but the funding is still there, the need is still there, what may have? Then everything goes to the floor. Assembly floor, Senate floor, which means all 80 assembly members and all 40 senators get to vote on these legislations that pass through all of these committees. So if you're lucky and you've made it to the floor, now you got to convince 80 assembly members and 40 senators, or at least a majority, because bills are either majority or 2/3. So if you need 2/3, you really need to walk the halls, which now has translated to virtual environments of walking the halls and meeting with them, meeting with their staff and legislators to let them know this is important. So once it gets to the Assembly and the Senate floor, all those bills that are there have to pass by the House of Origin by June 4th. If they do not pass, that means they stay there. So let me take a quick question. James has his hand up, if you're ready. No. James, can you explain the constituent number of the state legislature? I think McCarty is TK champion. Okay. I'm trying to understand your question, James, in terms of the constituent number of the state legislature. If you don't mind elaborating, and then I'll continue here for a second. So there's something called a summer recess. So we kind of get this 4-week break in between this entire process. July through August is not really a break for advocates. This is a time where now we know that those assembly bills moved over to the Senate and the Senate bills now moved over to the Assembly. And guess what you get to do? You get to redo the whole process all over again. New fresh faces, new fresh people, new staff, and new politicians to now interact with your legislation. So you take those 4 weeks and you start walking the halls and educating staff on why your legislation matters or why it's punitive and you have to unfortunately oppose. Not every legislation is made equally, and not every legislation can be deemed a support position, right? So it depends on where you're at, and it depends what type of legislation it is. So these 4 weeks of summer recess are really important to use it wisely to communicate. Now, this is heading towards the midpoint of the marathon. Do you know where the Senate's going to land in terms of supporting your idea, or do you believe that they're not there yet? It's not in alignment with the Senate goals and vision. So how do we support them and empower them to understand your cause and why this legislation matters? Then they come back. So we then have last 2 months where we redo the process, where assembly bills now go through the Senate policy and fiscal committees if they cost more than $250,000, and then Senate bills go to the Assembly and redo that entire process and then also through the Appropriations Committee. There's something called the suspense file. And we like the suspense file. Those are the most costly bills. And so at the same time that this is taking effect, guess what else is happening on the other side of the ledger? Can anyone guess what's also happening during this June timeframe, May-June timeframe with the governor? No guesses? The budget. They're working on the budget. And so they're negotiating how much money does the state have. So the appropriations committee holds the most costly bills in something called the suspense file, because they're trying to reassess how much money and how much flexibility will we have in the state budget to pay for all these bills. And so once we're getting towards the close of the legislative session, which in this case was September 10th, the legislative cycle is in 2 sessions. The first one starts in an odd year and is the longest. The second is in an even year and is the shortest. It ends in August. The reason being is that next year is an election year. So there will be a lot of politicians seeking re-election, and they need to dedicate some time to that process. So this entire calendar is a little shorter next year, which is a good thing and a bad thing, because it means less time. So we're heading towards the September 10th timeframe. All those bills that made it out of the appropriation committee means that the Senate supports it, or at least believes in the process. And now you got to convince all 40 senators and all 80 assembly members, once again, to continue to support the last remaining bills as they make it to the floor. And so that's a very crunch time. Imagine every issue on the planet is talking to the same politician you're talking to. So what's really critical as an advocate, as an organization that's hitting these really critical touch points, is be concise, be direct. What is your ask? What are your supporting facts on your request? And why does it matter? Tell the story. Don't forget, you all collectively in this room have a story to tell. You have a set of constituents that believe in you and need your voice on their behalf. So don't forget those key points, because these elected officials, and Kai will shake his head, these elected officials are meeting with 40 to 50 different groups in one day. We never let them take a bathroom break. I feel really bad. They would eat their lunch right in front of you, but we had them going because constituents matter. And these elected officials have selected to be your representative. And so they're there making these difficult decisions, or sometimes, super exciting opportunities, but they need a collective support from the community. Is this a good idea for my backyard? Yes or no? And if it's not, then what modifications could we seek? What changes should I request? And if they're in leadership position and you find yourself in a situation where your elected official is one of the majority leaders, is a representative that has a high rank in the legislature, use it to your advantage and keep feeding them information that, yes, that's a great idea. No, that's not a great idea. We shouldn't do that. It actually is going to equal all of these ramifications. And then the legislature goes home on September 10th at 9 p.m. It was the best night of my life. 9:10, they clocked out and we all got to sleep. Normally they end around 2 a.m. So that was very exciting. We then have 1 month. Governor, do we want to support this, or do we have issues with it? Do we want to continue to say that we want to make sure that the governor signs a bill? So you spent the last month really focusing on administration, and you should have already met with them in August and July to give them a for them to be concerned that authority. So always engage the governor's office. They have a dedicated unit that only focuses on legislation. So don't forget them. And also don't forget the Department of Finance. They are the right hand to every governor. They look at the fiscal implications. So if your bill is tagged fiscal, if you have to go through appropriations committee, don't forget the Department of Finance and letting them know why your issue matters. Do I have any questions? Let me pause to check the chat. So I got a question. What is the strategy to find the best champion for your bill? Is it always best to go with your local representative? Can you also talk about negotiating amendments to your bills? So what's the best strategy for finding a champion? Depending on the issue area, look at, has this person legislator taken up this topic before? Are they the chair of the issue area? So let's say you want to take housing. Are they the chair of the Assembly or Senate Committee Housing Policy Committee? Are they the budget chair in the committee that discusses, because the budget committee is broken up in subcommittees? Are they the sub chair? And then if they're not, are they in the committee of those topics? Because that's how you start learning, oh, they're interested in this information. You don't want to pick an author who might have great intentions, but just is not your subject matter expert, because they might not be able to sell the idea. They have to believe it in themselves. And we do have a lot of legislators who they care about the environment. Then you go and pick Senator Allen. He's a great champion for protection of environmental causes. You want to talk about education. We look at Assemblymember O'Donnell. He's the chair of Assembly Education Committee. Great champion, very strong, very articulate. He's a senior statesman at this point. If you want to look at housing, you look at someone like the pro tem Toni Atkins. She believes in housing. That's been her #1 issue. So you really want to take your time in figuring out and sell your idea to multiple offices. Don't get worried about, okay, this author says yes, this author, because then someone could become co-authors. And the more co-authors you have, the more politicians that sign on as co-authors. That means you're that much closer to getting more buy-in and support, because these assembly members and senators talk to their colleagues and they want their ideas to succeed. So they also have a commitment to making sure that the bill moves forward. So don't always get fixated in going with your local representative if they are not the right messenger. And you could have a conversation with them and let them know, I'm really interested in this issue. Would your office be interested in it? Or is there another colleague that we should talk to? And your elected official and their staff can recommend different authors to pitch ideas to. And then negotiating amendments to your bills. This is one where I'll call on Kai, because unfortunately, as management organizations, we find ourselves in this space a lot. Negotiating amendments take place behind closed doors most of the time. By the time you get to a public hearing where you watch it on TV and you have a line of people testifying, or now we're calling in on our phones, it's over. That's a show. We're just doing pleasantries and going through the process of having the public discourse. But everything has been already communicated behind closed doors. So the strategy that I use in negotiating amendments is making sure that once I find a bill and I want to support it, but have X, Y, and Z as these kind of are red flags, because that's not how the program works. And as a subject matter expert for schools, we know what are the strategies to make this successful. I would talk to the author staff, the sponsors, and let them know, we love your idea. We want to support it. Can we make these modifications to make the bill stronger? And everyone understands that bills go through an entire process. And so no bill looks alike from the first time it got introduced. It goes through various changes. Now, if the author's not willing to make the changes, we have authors who are young and inexperienced. We go through the committee consultants and we suggest to the committee consultants, if you make the following modifications, we can make this law work or this legislation work. And the committee consultants are responsible for that. Yes, don't fall in love with your bill. It's #1 advice that everyone gets when they enter the building. Don't fall. Kai, is there something I may have missed on those 2 points?
Yeah, I think you hit it spot on, Sarah. But the key piece is I like the way you sort of stratified that approach. I mean, if you have an amendment, first of all, you have to be tracking the bill. So set yourself up in a process where you're tracking the bills that you're interested in and see how they progress. And if you see something, you have to like know the date that that bill will be in a committee hearing so that you could talk to the sponsors or the bill authors, just like Sarah said. But if you run into roadblocks, I think her next step where she said, talk to the committee consultant was a key point. And if you're, and the way that you sort of break through is you have to sort of, sort of be not necessarily an expert, but provide some expertise in that area so that they could sort of bite on to something and say why your amendment and why not what they have in the bill. So I think as long as your comments or your amendments are, value added, I think you have a good shot. So.
Any other questions before I move on from this slide? James?
Yeah, I had a question actually a couple slides ago when you had the slide about the Assembly and the Senate, the constituents, where does that number just seems way off to me. So I'm wondering where that number comes from and what are you referring to in terms of constituents?
So this is from the legislative website. Every 10 years we do a census. And that's where it comes from. It's the jurisdictions that they administer. So maybe I haven't checked in, and I'll double check before sending the final slide deck to Julian to double check that those numbers are still holding from when I pulled them a year ago.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, when you just think about how many millions of adults there are, and people there are in California, that number seems like it should be in the millions as opposed to the thousands.
I'll double check.
Okay. And thank you. It's great information.
Okay. Okay. So next slide. So speaking the language, I always want to be helpful and leave you with context, because in our world, we love, and I'm sure in all of your worlds, don't we love our acronyms? There should be a law, no more acronyms. So I wanted to make sure you had this information at your disposal. So a bill is a proposal to change, repeal, or add to existing state law. For education, we have 2 education books. I don't know if you could see them behind me, but there's 2 ed code books. That's how much government statutory regulations we have to abide by, that we are so lucky that we have broken up into books. The Assembly bill is AB. So when you hear the word AB and then a number, that means that it's a piece of legislation introduced by Assembly member. The Senate bill, SB, means it was introduced in the Senate. There's also other acronyms, but I just wanted to tease out the ones that are much more popular if you think about taking down this path. ACA or SCA is an Assembly constitutional amendment or Senate constitutional amendment. When we're trying to make huge reforms, think of Prop 1, the gas tax to then update the highways, anything that requires seeking voter approval that would need to pass through a ballot initiative goes through this process to make a constitutional amendment that then goes before the voters. There's ACR and SCR, and those have to do with Assembly concurrent resolutions, Senate concurrent resolutions. So they're just different types of legislation that the legislature vets. And so the most frequent ones that you will see is the AB and SB. And then my favorite process. So remember I told you that February 19th was the deadline to introduce legislation? Well, there's always loopholes. And our loophole is called gut and amend. And it's when amendments to a bill are put in that remove the current contents of a bill that has already been introduced and strip it entirely and come up with new provisions completely. So this is something that as seasoned advocates, we're constantly vigilant, or we've had to pursue this in order to seek rapid modifications. Think of like independent studies for school districts having to implement distance learning at the same time that we're coming back in person. We've had to have multiple modifications of that law. And so we have used this mechanism to try to push something that we may have not become aware was needed in January and February, but then by June, we realized, oh my gosh, we need to sound the alarms. Something's wrong here. And if we don't have these statutory changes by the end of that legislative year, we may not have the ability to perform our duties for schools, serving our students, hiring staff. And so there is a loophole called gut and amend. So if you ever find yourself in a pickle and think that it's really a worthy cause, a legislator who has a vehicle that may no longer progress, because legislators introduce about 20 bills a year. So they're limited to 20. And then because of COVID this year, they were told in March, actually 12. And so many of them were frustrated because what do you tell those constituents that, okay, sorry, we introduced your bill, but now we've been instructed by leadership to scale back and scale down the number of bills. So there is this process, should your issue be of urgency or an emergency, that you can use the gut and amend. And for us, we're constantly monitoring what are schools needing as we're returning back to school that might need statutory changes. So why does advocacy matter? Well, the decision is highly important. And for me, I use the school example. So it's important for a school district. It's important for a county office of education. It's important for the whole public education system or as education employees. Sometimes the decision makers may not understand or have not made up their minds, and they need information. They need validated feedback from their constituents of the impacts of said legislation. And guess who's always engaging? Your opposition. So if your opposition's out there and you're not, who's going to be heard? The one communicating. So knowing where your issue lies. We had a situation, we were able to be part of a broadband coalition. I'm very proud to have partnered with CSAC. I'm sure many of you know the county association. We partner with CSAC, California Forward, and with the Rural Counties Association. So here's an education organization partnering with our local governments, and we were able to mount a request. We requested $8 billion for broadband connectivity throughout the state of California, and we were able to successfully redirect $6 billion in federal funds to start building out the last mile and the middle mile throughout the state of California. It was a difficult undertaking. One, because I'm not a broadband expert. I'm an education expert. But what COVID revealed to us is a lot of our students did not have access to connectivity or technology. Many of our regions, despite their location, may have white zones where they had zero access despite hotspots being shipped by schools to bring down connectivity to ensure that the student was receiving access to instruction. And so it became an access issue to public education that we were not serving our students. Therefore, it was important to build this coalition on an issue that may not have been primary to schools at one point, but definitely became top of mind because of COVID. And so opposition, AT&T, number one, they've spent a lot of money trying to kill our requests. In the end, it had to be scaled down. We had requested 8 billion, we received 6, and now we're going through the regulatory process. And guess who's still at the table opposing through the regulatory process? AT&T, T-Mobile, the California Cable Association. So as an advocate, I cannot stop advocating. I have to be in the same rooms with them to remind PUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, there's a law that was passed to build out the middle mile and the last mile because our students are not being served, our families aren't being served, our small businesses are being served. Let's stay true to what the law is requiring as you build out regulation. So your opposition is always there. So we need to make sure that if there's someone who may have a different viewpoint, that you're always countering that with your facts and information and story. And then you know the facts. This is your issue. and it may be an unknown to the legislature. So letting them know why it matters, telling your story is critical. And that's why advocacy truly does matter. If we are to be a representation of all of the constituents, we need to make sure that your voices are always at the table. So James says, so the constituent number must be per assembly member. Yes, it's per assembly member, not per the Senate as a whole and the assembly as a whole. It's per politician. So just a few key takeaways in terms of, because my hope is after this presentation, I fired you up. I'm like a good cup of coffee. You're all ready to go. You're ready to advocate after this meeting. You're going to be calling Julian going, what is our platform? What are our top priorities? And how are we going to get something moving? Because you're excited and you're activated. And I just gave Julian tons more work. You're welcome, Julian. Planning your advocacy efforts. So the things to identify first is identify your issue. What is the issue before you that needs to be addressed? What is the problem that has taken place? Is it housing? Is it EDD? Is it a lack of affordable housing or higher education? Is it a lack of seamless transitions between services as you're trying to provide support to families who need mental or social, emotional support systems? Identify the issue and set your goal and objectives. What is the goal? To close the achievement gap. What's the goal? To make sure that we get X% of families into stable housing. What's the goal? To, remove barriers to entry to the workforce. Set your goals, and then what are the objectives? How are we going to accomplish that goal? Identify who your target audience is. Is the issue at the local level? Is it city council? Is it your board of supervisors? Is it, the special districts association that has the jurisdiction over your water rights? Just knowing which the entity is responsible for cuts a lot of the work out. Because if it's a local issue, you then can communicate at a faster pace than if it was the state or federal. Federal works on a different cycle. And so they just do their own thing, but we have to remind them they're still our representatives. But at the state level, as I mentioned, they're only in Sacramento from January to September, and they go to their backyard. So they can't create legislation. They could start drafting ideas in the fall, but they can't introduce it until January. And then you only have a 2-month window for introductions of ideas. So start using this time wisely and establish your message. The last thing you want is to go as a coalition, think of the group in this meeting, and then everyone go in with their own ask. Because as a legislator, they only have 5 minutes where they're really with you. They're really with you. And if 3 people start talking about, well, I'm really interested in our community college and they have a new president, and you're really there to talk about housing, well, now you just piqued your politician's interest to talk about the local community college and the new president. Has he met the new president? Has she met the new president? You just took them off tangent, and to get them back in now a window of 2 to 3 minutes is so challenging. So make sure everyone in your meeting, and I mean this seriously because we've had incidents when we go advocate, even in education, is everyone know your story. What is the message that you're there to convey? And then develop an action plan. Are you going to start writing op-eds to create local noise through your media, through the newspapers? Are you going to host events, webinars to start providing information so that you build a movement? Who are your partners? Who are your partners that need to come out and support you once you introduce this piece of legislation? And making sure that you sequence that all with the timing of the legislature. Making sure that you've built enough momentum, built enough noise, gotten people informed. And as you're walking the halls, it won't be a surprise. They will know, I have been told by my constituents, this is a real problem. So preparing your story. Think about how the proposed policy changes, helps, or hurts your profession. For us, school districts or public education as a whole. Back up your story with facts and real life examples. The last thing you want to go is to give anecdotal information that doesn't belong to you. Make sure you know the story. And if you are going to give other people's story, have that data at your disposal. Talk to that person before you go in, have your information, your sources down, because legislators have their staff with them, and the staff will follow up with you and say, hey, that story piqued my interest. Can you tell me more? And if it wasn't your story and you don't know where it came from, then it removes the validity of your issue. So just know that you have to back up your information with data and give a human perspective to the issue at hand. Are we here to talk about students? Are you here to talk about women in the workforce or the lack of childcare? Are you here to talk about small businesses and what's happening with all the various changes that are taking place every day outside of your control? Are you here to talk about homelessness and housing? What is the issue and how do you color it in with that human story that X amount of constituents from their district have been affected by this? Statewide, this is an experience that 30% of Californians are going through. We have seen housing prices rise by X amount, yet salaries remain stagnant or are going in the opposite direction. But have those details at your disposal and feel free to leave a one-pager. Don't worry that, oh, I'm taking a piece of paper. Leave the piece of paper, make sure to have contact information in there so that the staffer can follow up with you afterwards. Make it easy for them. Remember, they're meeting with 40 other organizations doing the same thing. Why does your issue matter more? Or why does it need to rise to the top and be that important so that they can make a decision once that piece of legislation hits their desk and they have to make a decision, yay or nay? So make sure to make it easy for them by giving them all that information. So know your issue. Make sure that as you're setting up your advocacy day, that everyone attending your meeting understands the key issues at hand that are going to be discussed. So I'll give you an example of what happened to me in a meeting with Assemblymember McCarty. Assemblymember McCarty has ADHD, so he really easily gets distracted on the natural. We were going in to discuss increasing the base rate for education. All of a sudden, one of my amazing members started talking to him about his TK idea because, again, he's the TK guy. So that he caught on that. He was like, oh, you want to talk about TK? And we spent the next 10 minutes talking about TK when we were really there to talk about addressing the overall base grant so that every student has additional support so we can meet the costs and requirements that have been mandated through school districts but have not been addressed in the budget. So did we think that that meeting went successful after we left his room? Did everyone look at my poor member and go, what did you do? And then she apologized because she realized, oh, I don't know how to reel this back in. And in our talking points, we don't have TK at all because actually we're all over the place and can't, as an organization, make a decision if we're yay or nay for TK. So we didn't even have it as part of our platform because we can't come up to consensus, and yet one person derailed the entire conversation. And then Assemblymember McCarty, when he saw me, was, oh, so you're supporting TK? I never thought your organization would support TK. And I had to smile and say, you know, we can't because we represent the entire state. And I'm so sorry. But let's talk about base grant. Redirect. So make sure that all of your information is on point. Everyone has read it. Everyone has contact information. You feel free to use different organizations' advocacy tools. You don't have to buy your own tools. CASBO has a budget policy tracker. You could type in casville.org. I monitor our website, and you could just type in bill numbers and it pops everything out. You could go to leginfo.ca.gov, and you don't have to buy these fancy tools to be able to access the information. It's public knowledge and it's public information that's there at your disposal. But make sure that everyone at least has the base understanding of what these what the issue that you're going to talk with the legislature is about, that understands that, hey, our ask is this. What's the ask? This. And if they redirect, what do? We pivot back. We pivot back, bring them back. They're like 5-year-olds. You got to bring them back, remind them, and smile, and just make sure that everyone's asking the same request. We support or we oppose a particular piece of legislation or regulation, or we're here to introduce this new idea because it's going to X, Y, and Z. Thank you, Kai. And so the display information there that I have, the little icons that you see on the slide deck, those are how I display information. Those are the copies of our one-pagers that I've taken to the Capitol. Very colorful, clean, simple, less is more, with highlighted support, oppose. That way, when they're looking at it in the 5 minutes they really are granting you, you might have a 10-minute meeting, but again, their attention span is 5 minutes long. Make sure that they can see it. Support, oppose, and then they can ask you follow-up questions. Make it easy for your audience. In setting up your meeting, and I call them meet and greets, you feel free to request by sending a letter, sending an email to the legislator scheduler. You could call everyone. So everyone has a scheduler. Every politician has a dedicated staffer who knows this politician's calendar. And for some politicians, the millennial politicians, they're now posting their calendar on their legislative website. So Assemblymember Kevin Kiley, you could actually go to his calendar on his website and just see when he has availabilities. Super easy. Love it, because he is making it that much more accessible. And be sure to follow up with a phone call stating that give yourself 3 to 5 weeks before to set these meetings. So give yourself enough lead time. And depending on that legislative schedule, should be easier to get those meetings right now. But remember, April through August, you need to give yourself enough lead time to meet. Don't try to set up a meeting knowing that your bill's up in a committee next Wednesday and try to meet with them on a Thursday the week before. It's over. Too late. Try to give yourself 3 to 5 weeks of window opportunity. That way, if they ask you some difficult questions, you can modify your letter, your statement, if you're testifying publicly, to address those concerns. Make sure that it's a small group. The Capitol's really small. You have zero privacy. As fancy as the titles are in the Capitol, your office, I think that the fancier title is, the smaller or more cubicle-like your office is. So gotta love titles and prestige, but it comes with smaller spaces. So many of the times you'll see advocates and staff outside the Capitol hallways. It is what it is, folks. There is no space, and the Capitol right now is being renovated. So I'm hopeful that it will be updated and people will have better spaces. So the next 2 to 3 years shall be interesting to lobby because staff are being moved to a different building as the Capitol is being renovated. Arrive early. You never know if a politician is going in and out of hearings. So the same time from January through September, when you're trying to meet with them in the Sacramento office, remember that they're also taking bills in policy committees, or they're testifying on behalf of their own legislation. So try to arrive early just to give yourself a breather from walking the halls, running up the stairs because the elevators are jam-packed or they don't work, or you're on the wrong floor because for some reason the old floor numbers say 4, but when you go to the new site, it says 3. So you're on 2 different floors because the numbers don't match. So that happens a lot. And then the last piece of advice is avoid your personal political beliefs. Stick to the policy issue at hand. I do not let people know my political affiliation because CASBO doesn't pay me for my political affiliation. My responsibility is to be the voice for public schools, students, and administrators. That doesn't have a political affiliation. So be clear with your intentions that you're going there to discuss a policy matter and try to avoid the sticky, oh, you ran for governor but didn't win. How did that feel? Or I didn't like the recall, or I like the recall. Like that is not here or there. It's not the right space and might detract and might actually create friction for you and might remove someone who would have been your natural supporter because now you tick them off politically. So how to get involved, because I'm hopeful that after this session, you're all going to be texting Julian, telling him you're ready to get involved. So I'm sure that as Julian is your GR director, you can assist him moving forward in vetting legislation. You could sponsor your own legislation now that you have the tools to consider, is there an opportunity here? I have this problem statutorily, can I address it or not? You could host your own Legislator of the Year award. If you have an event in your region, is there an opportunity to thank a politician, to acknowledge their hard work, to recognize that maybe they're not 100% champion with you, but they're 75. So how do we get them 100%? Recognize them, bring them to your event, let them have a conversation with your stakeholders, and honor them if possible. If you have quarterly meetings that you already undertake, is this an opportunity to bring in a different politician at each quarterly meeting? That creates awareness, that creates recognition, so that when you come to Sacramento, they'll already know who you are. And then invite them to your community forum so that they could hear directly from your constituents what are those key issues. So I always like to leave this slide for everyone just to remind you of what's the cycle of advocacy in a different manner. I know some people are visual learners and some people need to get it over and over. But again, for the budget process, it's January through June. You could read people's budget reports. I do a news break that Julian gets a copy of. You could submit a letter of support or of a statement saying, Governor Newsom, we appreciate your budget. Thank you for taking on these issues. You could testify as the budget committees begin to deliberate on all of these budget proposals. You could testify. And because of distance environments, we can now testify virtually. So you don't have to fly up, which has been great for many. You could contact the governor's office, the budget committees, the Department of Finance, and meet with your elected officials to let them know where your value statement lies in terms of what you're seeing in the budget. And then on the policy side, March through June, submit your letters as you're reviewing legislation, or you've had a sponsor piece of legislation. Make sure that all of the members that are going to review your bills in each of the committees have met you, know who you are, and understand why this issue is critical. You could contact the bill author, you could contact their staff and their sponsors. Don't forget about sponsors. Let them know why you support or oppose their legislation. You could contact the policy and fiscal committees and let them know why you support or oppose that piece of legislation, and then testify. So it goes in this sequence. Testifying is the last thing we do. It's not the first thing. And I think, but it's the most public venue. But we do a lot of the grunt work behind the scenes. And then July through August, participate in calls to action. Get involved, write letters, let people know, hey, I'm here, I'm calling, I'm picking up the phone. Put me down as someone who supports these bills. And then October to December, this critical time right now, sponsor legislation, come up with your own ideas. How amazing would that be if you could come up with your own legislation that shares your vision and mission of what your region needs?